Have you ever wondered what would happen if you took one of the world's strongest men and gave him a giant sword? How easy or difficult would it be for him to actually use? All that and more in today's episode. Let's get started. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Screen Tested. Today we're going to be taking a look at something that I find absolutely fascinating. As a lot of you guys know, or if you're new around here, we have done a full series on giant swords. I have created my own functional real-world giant swords. I've tested them in full plate armor. I've tested them against full plate armor, things like concrete, wood, a whole bunch of different stuff. So you could say that I'm a little bit of a connoisseur of this type of content. And something that a lot of people have been fascinated about and brought up in those comment sections was, I wonder how somebody who is, physically massive in terms of their stature, in terms of their muscle mass, all that sort of stuff, how they would handle a giant sword like this. And I came across this video. Now this one here is from Juji, right, with Brian Shaw. Now if you're unaware, Brian Shaw is one of the former world's strongest men. I don't know if he still competes, but he did compete and he's, won a bunch, right? And I found this video absolutely fascinating. Now I think there's a big important caveat to mention here, that they are approaching this video and this, type of, exercise from the point of training, strength training, that sort of thing, not necessarily from swordsmanship. It's more so about the concept of, one of the strongest dudes, Brian Shaw, using a really big sword. So, with that out of the way, let's get started.
So this is just some giant sword Ashman makes, and it translates really well. I've been getting the flow arts this year, guys. I started with rope flow. I got a bow staff, started teaching myself some kind of martial artsy looking stuff. It's not martial arts, it just looks like martial arts.
I think that's an important caveat that he brings up, right? He's essentially doing things that looks like martial arts but not necessarily is martial arts. Now, what do I think about the concept, right? These sorts of things for training. I think they're awesome, really. I guess that's the best way to describe it is, like for example, if you were someone who really wanted to bring a giant sword into the real world and you wanted to train for that, obviously training with a giant sword is a good way to get good at a giant sword. However, I do think that there would be more efficient ways, obviously building up muscle mass in specific areas that are obviously going to help with the giant sword. The movement of it is more efficient, right? And there are going to be clear benefits of doing it, things like hand-eye coordination, balance, speed. It's a full body workout. So I definitely think that there are big benefits to using, like, let's say, a giant sword type object, right, to train with. But I wouldn't necessarily say it should be the only training. I feel like that's the important caveat there.
You want to respect the blade, because these are real swords. They're not respect. Yeah. Now, we don't have any...
They're weighted wood kind of training blades. Now, there are obviously training blades that are made of wood and, high density plastic and things like that. I don't necessarily class them as real swords, but they are training swords, for sure, 100%.
Your hips into it.
You'll feel it out.
So like the first movement that they're trying obviously with their giant sword is actually a legit technique type deal, workout, whatever we want to call it, that Indian club, weighted Indian club. They're just doing it with obviously not a club. I mean, it is a club, it's a giant wooden sword club, but same sort of deal, right? But what I want to note first, the first thing that I'm noticing, right, is if you look at Brian, his center of gravity is very high. So first things first, right? When you get into some swordsmanship, or not even just swordsmanship, a lot of sort of combat stuff, there's obviously pros and cons to where your center of gravity is. But for something heavy like a giant sword, you're not going to be wanting to stand directly upright like this. The reason why is obviously you have a really long blade that is very heavy, and when you spin it around, it wants to pull you with it, and it wants to pull you off your center of gravity. So how do you mitigate this? Well, you get a lower center of gravity. That way, when you have a big giant blade and you're swinging it around and you're moving it, you have a lot more structure in your form. And so when we look at Brian here, he's quite upright, and we can see the blade is, if we look at his feet, his feet are kind of wobbling all over and his body's kind of wobbling all over, and it's because his center of mass is just so high. I also wanted to comment very quickly on the shoes that Brian is wearing. I know that seems like a weird thing to want to comment on, So my entire life I've worn things like this, just completely flat-footed, simple slip-on shoes. You know, I've fought in these, I've trained in these, I've kicked in these, I've done everything you can possibly imagine. However, when it comes to something like actually getting out into nature in the real world where things are slippery, things are wet, those ones have been terrible because I would slip over all the time. So then I upgraded to things like this where it's still a flat-footed shoe. If you're enjoying today's episode, you should consider subscribing. It is free after all. So I'm also able to plant my feet a lot more firmer and create that structure. And it starts here, it starts at the shoe. So a flat-footed shoe for these sorts of applications is a lot better. And that's why, for the most part, right, you will see a lot of flat-footed shoes in types of combat type of applications, because it allows you to obviously have much greater, you know, structure on your feet rather than modern sneakers that essentially have big cushions in them, and then, you know, they kind of lift your feet in weird ways that you don't really want when you're trying to do these sorts of movements. And if you actually look at Juji's shoes, he's got flat-footed shoes on. They're like flat-footed sneakers, but same sort of thing. And you may not think that the shoes are a big deal, but they really are, because that's obviously the start of the entire structure of your body. That's where the kinetic chain starts. That's where your power comes from. That's where your structure comes from. So if your feet aren't planted, you don't have good purchase on your feet, right, then everything else is going to be more difficult. Next thing I should mention, right, is the placement of Brian's hands on the giant sword. So leverage is like super important when it comes to giant swords, right? So you want to get that second hand as far back as possible, and that creates that lever point. So it's just going to make it a little bit easier to maneuver the blade and the tip. So it's one of those things where if somebody obviously hasn't really held many swords or used many swords, they might put their hands in kind of strange places. And I wouldn't say that Brian's putting it in a strange place. I would just say for this particular application, he should be getting, like, he would want to get his hand right to the end of that very small handle, honestly. I think the handle could be a little bit longer.
Left foot forward.
Okay.
Yes. Now you're gonna support it as a leverage. There you go.
So we should also have a look at how they're both standing, right? You see Juji here has his knees bent a little bit, and Brian is a lot more stiff in the leg. So Juji's going to have a lot more control over that center of mass, like we mentioned earlier, whereas Brian, I think he's going to have a little bit of a trouble here. But let's see.
Create like a chopping motion.
Okay.
It naturally lends into something that looks.
Okay.
There you go. Hold on, hold mine.
I think it's worth noting here. All right, I feel like there's a couple of caveats here, right? Obviously, when you get a lot of muscle on your body, like Brian has here, it does make movements over your head and just different types of movements a little bit more difficult than the average person, because they just have so much mass around their body, right? But if you look at the difference between how Juji moves and how Brian moves, you'll see with Juji, it's a lot more of a full body motion. He's getting his entire body into it, you know, right from the structure of his legs, his hips, his core, and then up to his shoulders and his arms, where I think Brian is muscling it a little bit more just with kind of like the arms, if we have a look. So he's not really getting a lot of rotational movement throughout the upper part of his body. It's more just, he's just muscling it with his arms.
So you imagine you're kind of doing
right
like an upper slice. See that?
Yeah, so I think when we see Brian do it, right, he's a little bit more stiff, I guess is the best way. To describe it. His body movement is just a little bit harder for him to kind of reach in the same sort of way.
Do it again?
I do this one a lot.
An upper roll slice. An upper roll slice. Yeah, I guess. Upper roll slice. You could just call it an Unterhau, but okay. Yeah, sure. Upper roll slice. Love it.
You're switching the blade so you can, the stab.
Giant swords, man. Everybody loves a giant sword.
Wah!
I messed that one up.
Wah! Sha! Ya! Sha!
So that's kind of the end of the giant sword training section that they have in this particular episode. There'll be a link down below if you want to check out the full video. I recommend, obviously, if you're interested in strength training or any of that sort of stuff, both Juji and Brian, I both do that sort of stuff, and I watch both of them. And I found it just fascinating, right, coming from a perspective of, I've created a bunch of giant swords at this point, I've tested them a bunch at this point, and watching this obviously from this is more of like a workout perspective, right, for a fitness perspective, rather rather than trying to create a functional weapon. But it is interesting just to see the dynamics of someone who is as big and as strong as Brian use a sword like this. And there's just a lot of little, like, little things that I think if he he trained with it or something like that, he could probably obviously get way better. I mean, Brian usually gets pretty good at anything he puts his mind to, and it's just interesting to see kind of like a raw how someone as strong as him would come into this and how they would go, right? At least I found that interesting, and I hope you guys found it interesting. But that's going to be all. Thank you guys for watching. I genuinely hope you enjoyed. Remember to like and subscribe and leave a comment down below what you thought of today's episode. And as always, I'll see you next week in another episode. Yeah, have a good one.